Ms. Pudding.
My lady, may I call Miss Lara Wong?
I do solemnly, sincerely and freely
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
Ms. Wong, you have provided a helpful witness statement to this module of the inquiry, and it should be in front of you, and it's INQ 000587993. You are the leader and founder of Clinically Vulnerable Families, or CVF, is that right?
That's correct.
You have given evidence to other modules of this inquiry, so I'll take you through your professional background and that of CVF quickly. CVF is a primarily volunteer group with an online membership base, is that right?
That's correct.
It's a grassroots organization founded in August of 2020. What was the event which triggered the founding of the group?
So in August 2020, it was quite clear that schools were returning, and the guidance was at the time that all children must be in school, and must was an enforceable must. And that was very concerning for myself, my professional background being in teaching, but also with my scientific knowledge. My initial sort of degree was in pathology and microbiology. So I understood about disease transition. I understood there were concerns about airborne transmission. And it was very clear that in enclosed environments that where children were going to be packed tightly close to each other was going to be a high risk of transmission for our families.
CVF's mission and purpose is set out in your statement at paragraphs 8 and 9, and it's to support, inform, and advocate for those in CV households as they face an ongoing threat posed by COVID-19. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Can you give us an indication of the number of members that you have?
Oh, gosh, 1 second. Can I just double check?
Yeah, well, I can help you, in fact.
Thank you.
It's not a memory test. So you deal with it at paragraph 19 of your statement.
Yeah.
You say there's a combined membership and following of 52,000.
Yep.
Is that right?
So, I mean, it grows over time. So that's also why I don't know off the top of my head, because the current membership, it's increasing. So, yes, at that point in time when I wrote the statement, that would have been true, yes.
Okay. Can you tell us what the rough proportion of your members are between clinically extremely vulnerable and clinically vulnerable?
I wouldn't be able to tell you that, unfortunately. I don't think we have data on that, although we have collected data, but I don't have that available to me. But I might be able to find you a breakdown if that's something you need.
Okay. Can you tell us about the proportion of members who are children?
So again, children aren't generally specifically members because it's, again, my background being teaching, it would be a safeguarding concern potentially if they were involved in our group, and some of the discussions might be quite concerning to them.
Of course.
So it is adults, and maybe some children have made their way in, but not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Before I ask you about the impact of the pandemic on children who are living with clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable family members, or children who are themselves clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable, I'd like to touch briefly on the meaning of the terms CV, clinically vulnerable, and clinically extremely vulnerable. These categories, they have a clinical definition which evolved in the course of the pandemic. And the criteria differed between adults and children, sometimes.
Somewhat, yeah.
Yes, somewhat. And between different contexts. So, for example, some children were classed as clinically vulnerable in the context of vaccine priority, but maybe not in the context of education.
So
If you could just wait for the question. It's coming. But just that, to explain that it's a bit of a slippery concept to grab hold of because there are some variables over time. But if we begin with clinically extremely vulnerable, so you deal with that in your witness statement at paragraph 4. These were individuals who were advised to shield. And we have the technical definition provided in the witness statement of Duncan Burton, my lady, from whom you will hear evidence. He's the Chief Nursing Officer for England. And I'm just going to pull it up now, Ms. Wong, so you can see. It's INQ 000588020, and he deals with it here at paragraph 713. So he says, on the 18th of March, the UK CMOs agreed the clinical criteria for clinically extremely vulnerable individuals who would be advised to shield, and a shielding list was developed. And the criteria are solid organ transplant recipients, people with specific cancers, and if we can scroll over the page, please. People with severe respiratory conditions like cystic fibrosis or severe asthma. People with rare diseases and inborn errors of metabolism that significantly increase the risk of infection, and women who are pregnant with significant heart disease. These clinical criteria, and in fact it says at paragraph 714, the clinical criteria did not discriminate initially on the basis of age, so they applied to children and to adults at that stage. There were roughly 93,000 children identified at that stage who were on the shielding list. And so this clinically extremely vulnerable group, would you agree, it was a smaller group than those who would be clinically vulnerable?
Yes, of course.
Yes, of course, okay. So we can take that down now. Turning then away from extremely vulnerable to clinically vulnerable. You deal with this at paragraph 13 of your witness statement. You say that these are individuals who remain at higher clinical risk to COVID-19 and qualify for vaccines based on those risks. And it's a group that includes the clinically extremely vulnerable people, but it's broader. Is that right?
Okay, so yes, it's broader. So today, actually, there's been a change. So I just need to highlight that. So the clinically vulnerable group, as we knew it, which also includes people who were formerly clinically extremely vulnerable, many of them will no longer receive vaccines. So around 13 million people, including children, will no longer be receiving vaccines going forward. And the UK is an outlier in that decision, but obviously that's I've got concerns around that. But so in terms of the clinically vulnerable group, you said about them being a vaccine priority group,
Yeah.
but it didn't refer to sort of education and how they were treated.
Well, actually,
So
Ms. Wong,
I know that was earlier.
yeah,
sorry.
no, I'm going to take you to the Green Book now.
Okay, yes, please do.
We'll deal with it in stages,
Yes,
but don't
of
worry.
course.
You will be able to give your evidence. So if
Remembering,
we,
of course, that I have been through this before, so I know a fair bit about the categories,
sure.
the definitions, and as long as helped me before.
yes, certainly, my lady. I'll take it briefly. If we could just pull up, please, INQ 000408795, page 3. So this is the excerpt from the Green Book, which you refer to in your statement. Clinical risk groups for individuals under the age of 16 years. And this is, the Green Book, so that we're clear, is a guide for professionals administering vaccines. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And when you refer to in your statement to children who are clinically vulnerable, are you referring to children who fulfill these criteria?
Yes.
Okay. So you're using this, even though it's ostensibly produced for vaccines, this is the sort of template for clinically vulnerable children.
In the Green Blue, well, okay, so to take it back a step.
Sure.
Clinically vulnerable wasn't a term that existed prior to the pandemic. So we wouldn't have identified ourselves as being clinically vulnerable. We wouldn't have recognised that as a term. However, when the pandemic hit, these new classifications were kind of rolled out. And suddenly, people who would have recognised that they were at higher risk, they had health conditions such as those listed here, those people would find themselves suddenly identified in these new groups and trying to understand what they meant, including children. And so the problem was for many people that they didn't kind of understand what that meant, how it applied to them. They probably had some idea that they were at higher risk because many of these people, almost all of these people, were in the flu priority vaccine group anyway. So they knew that they had conditions that put them at greater risk of most transmissible diseases. However, these children did face sort of particular risks, and they were identified, and they've always been in those kind of high-risk groups.
Yeah.
So we would recognise it based on vaccine priority, but there is a grey area there that I should also point out. And that's because there are many other conditions that they can't list out. There are rare diseases and other things that they have to consider. So in the grey area, there will have been children who will have been picked up, and they will also be clinically vulnerable, but they might not be on that list.
I see. So it's not completely exhaustive,
No.
because there will be people not on the list who would be clinically vulnerable. Okay, I think I understand. And just before we take this down, just to clarify, the people who fulfill this criteria in the Green Book would include some additional categories which aren't in clinically extremely vulnerable. And those categories would be, for example, people with chronic conditions of the heart, so they're not necessarily in the CEV category, or conditions of the digestive system, for example. So here we see severe gastroesophageal reflux. And there are other additions, but it is a group which is broader than the CEV group.
So the CEV and the CV group both evolved over time.
Yes.
And obviously with our scientific understanding, it was a new pathogen. People were trying to understand and gather evidence and data to try and, quantify those risks that individuals faced. And so there were conditions, you're talking about CEV, and I just want to point to something that was mentioned previously by Professor Snooks in Module 2, where she said it was somewhat arbitrary divide between the two groups. So they were both recognised as higher risk, but where the circle was scribed, there may have been people who fell outside that circle who had, as high risks, maybe higher than some of the people inside that circle.
Sorry.
So just that, yeah. But anyway, to go back, CEV group. And the CV group, they're all at risk. Some of them are at greater risk, and many in the CEV group were in the kind of like high risk categories with severe immune suppression, things like that too.
Okay, we can just take that down for now. Thank you very much. Okay, just before we leave this topic, my lady, I'd like to take you, Ms. Wong, to the witness statement of Dr. Shona Arora, who will give evidence on behalf of the UKHSA in a few weeks. Her statement is INQ 0005888110, paragraphs 3.94 and 3.95. Thank you very much. And it says, while a cohort of children was considered on a precautionary basis to potentially fall within the CEV group when it was originally defined, the guidance in relation to CV children was reviewed by the RCPCH and the NHS Clinical Director for Children in early May of 2020. The conclusion they reached was that the middle ground category of CV was not meaningful as applied to children who were either CEV or not at materially increased risk from contracting the virus. It was agreed by the UK CMOs that only those children with significant neurodevelopmental or other specific conditions need to be advised to shield. So, Ms. Wong, in the context of school attendance, the CV group for children no longer applied, certainly from the return to school in September of 2020. And there was no exception, pardon me, we can take that down now. There was no exception, for mandatory attendance for children who had previously been classed as clinically vulnerable.
No, they were still classed because that continued on into the vaccination group.
Yes, I see. So they
Sorry, I missed the final part.
Sorry, they were still classed as clinically vulnerable because they continued on into the vaccination group.
Right.
I see. But in terms of school attendance from September of 2020, well, in fact, when children returned to school in September of 2020, even those who had previously been shielding were required to return to school. But from September 2020 onwards, there was no exception for children who had been classed as clinically vulnerable. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And is your position that the wider CV criteria should still have applied to children and that families ought to have been able to keep those children home from school from September 2020 onward?
Well, we would advocate for a precautionary approach. Certainly, I think anyone who's a parent will understand that if their child is at increased risk, they will do something to protect their child. And if they're really aware of that, and of course everyone was, an example is children with type 1 diabetes. A third of the UK deaths were from people with diabetes. People would have seen it in the news. They'd been very alert and aware of those risks. As the science was evolving, and children hadn't been in schools, we have to remember this, the guidance at the time had pointed even sort of to support vulnerable children who were not to remain outside of school, even in the early return to school, in the May 2020 guidance. So INQ 000542499, and if I may read the guidance, is that okay?
I'm afraid not.
Okay, no worries. Okay, but they supported those children to remain outside school. Children who were clinically vulnerable and children who were in clinically vulnerable households had been identified, and they were advised that they could make a choice, and we would support that choice.
Are you talking about the guidance from May of 2020?
The May 2020 guidance.
Yes.
It was talking about other vulnerable children.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
So in May 2020, there was that guidance that allowed a judgment to be made about clinically vulnerable children to stay
to support them,
if appropriate. Yes, and from August onwards, there was a kind of guillotine, if I can put it that way, when all children were required to return. In fact, I think it's probably now a good point to bring up that guidance if we could. So that's INQ 000648028, page 13. So this is the guidance on the full opening of schools. And it says that in March, when the coronavirus outbreak was increasing, we made clear no parent would be penalized or sanctioned for their child's non-attendance. Now the circumstances have changed, and it's vital for children to return to school to minimize, as far as possible, the longer-term impact on children's education. And then if we move down then to the bullet points, so this means that from this point, the usual rules on school attendance will apply, including a parent's duty to secure that their child attends regularly at school, and schools' responsibilities to record attendance and follow-up absence remained. And there was the availability from that stage to issue sanctions, including fixed penalty notices, in line with local authorities' codes of conduct. We can take that down now. There is no exception there for children who were clinically vulnerable or even clinically extremely vulnerable. In your witness statement at paragraph 23, you describe this new guidance as a shift in tone away from CVF families' favor. How was this guidance received by CVF families?
It was an incredibly scary time. I mean, you have to remember that Eat Out to Help Out had been driving up infection rates just before schools were reopening. So everyone was very aware of the fact that the risks were increasing. Schools were not doing anything to manage airborne risks. So our families felt particularly exposed at that time. No particular risk assessment was in place for those children to support them. If someone's at higher risk, you would expect a risk assessment to have been carried out. But, we feel that kind of a quality impact assessments, whatever they should have done, was not sufficient. And our concerns, which were really obvious to them, because they had already identified them in their previous guidance, left us in an incredibly dangerous situation, and people had no option of flexibility. If your life is threatened by this potential virus, you can quit your job if you're an adult, but you can't do the same for your child's education. You can't for many reasons, but you are forced legally to attend school. If your child is registered at a school, you are required to attend. And so those school risks then were either a risk to their health or the health of the family, or a risk in terms of a legal risk that they then faced if they didn't send their children in.
And one other aspect, I suppose, of that guidance was that there was the availability of fines, and which we'll come on to in a moment, but also, is it right that previously children who weren't attending school because they were clinically vulnerable or shielding, there was remote education provided for those children, but from the return to school, from that stage, when attendance was mandatory, there wasn't remote learning provided to children who weren't in school on the whole?
Okay, so remote education was provided to all children prior to that point. So everybody had that option and nobody had to kind of make any difficult choices. But when schools returned, as you say, children who were shielding were unshielded at that point. And when they said all children must be in school, that included children with really high risks. Children who weren't even ever shielded, such as those with Down syndrome, who had significantly higher risks.
Sorry, Ms. Wong, if I could just pause you there. But the question I'm asking is that what changed also in that September time was that children who didn't attend school, they weren't given remote learning by their schools as a matter of course.
No, they weren't. And remote learning was offered to children who were COVID positive. And it was actively denied to children who were clinically vulnerable or in a clinically vulnerable household because it was not within the guidance. And schools had to follow the guidance, and they were not allowed to give children who didn't have COVID, so even other children with other sicknesses who may wanted to attend, somebody who broke their arm, they were not given an option of remote learning. It was very strictly controlled.
Okay. I'm just going to ask you now about fines. So at paragraph 53 of your witness statement, you describe the use of fines to promote attendance. Can you tell us about the experience of CVF families with fines? Okay, so I think it varied. Some schools, and I want to be really clear here when I speak about this, that we don't have any issues with teachers and head teachers, those people who were essentially trying to follow guidance that had been given to them. We're concerned about the government guidance here that caused this situation. But ultimately, schools have a process, and they know how to, if a child is causing an absence, and head teachers are judged on absences, they will try to address it by the normal protocols. And that includes pressuring families with fines, prosecutions, and a further thing that they had available to them was safeguarding the children via children's services. And we had a number of inappropriate referrals as a consequence of that. Okay. And were there also children and young people who were clinically vulnerable or in CVF families that were deregistered from school?
There were many children who were deregistered from school, and the government has data on that. They don't have data on which of those children were clinically vulnerable themselves or in a clinically vulnerable household, because that was not gathered.
Yeah, but can you just tell us, so there was the option for schools to issue fines to ensure that children attended school, and how did it come to be that some children were taken off the roll or deregistered from their school?
So quite frequently, and schools are aware of this, so there's a term called off-rolling. People won't be familiar with unless they're out, inside of schools. But off-rolling is where a child is removed from the school role in the interests of the school, but not of the child. And parents were quite frequently doorstepped by schools, or they wouldn't write things down. They would speak to them over the phone, and there'd be no record of this. But they would tell them, you're better off taking your child out of school. You're absent anyway. You're not getting any learning. It's not going to advantage you to continue on this path. Some schools even offered, oh, we'll save your place. You can't do that. I mean, anybody who knows about schools, there is no ability to save a child's space. So those children, you know, they had to choose. And so the parents who were threatened with fines and prosecutions were in really precarious circumstances because certain jobs, I mean, you couldn't continue on doing your job if you were to have a prosecution. And so it's really problematic for families. And so they had very little choice because their children weren't getting teaching and learning. So what advantage was there for them to keep them in school? So they were kind of persuaded by that. And they took their children out and they lost their, you know, their friends, their community, and, you know, in some cases, their ability to ever return back to that school.
Okay. I'm going to take you now to a section of the Children and Young People's Voice Report. It is INQ 000587936, page 169. Thank you very much. This section of the report sets out the experience of children who could not attend schools when they reopened because of clinical vulnerabilities in their families. Children and young people described how excluded and unsupported they felt by their school and their local authority, and how hard it was to be in a dispute over attendance. And I'm going to read here just the fourth paragraph, if we can scroll down. Thank you very much. So this is an account from a child aged 19 years old. And he says, lockdown didn't change much, but when government guidance changed just a few months later, online schooling wasn't really allowed and people had to go back into schools. That's when sort of things changed. Previously, my secondary school was willing to accommodate online learning. And when we asked them about it, when the government guidance changed, they originally were like, yep, you can continue online schooling because you have a heart condition. But then, just a few weeks later, they changed their mind and decided, no, you have to go back into school. It doesn't matter if you have a heart condition. It doesn't matter if you have clinical vulnerabilities. It doesn't matter if your entire family is in danger of catching COVID, and it could cause serious harm to you and your family. You have to go into school. They threatened to fine us. If we weren't willing to go into school, it was well over £120 per person in the family per day. So that was at the point where, well, I was withdrawn from the national schooling system, and then we had to look at other options. And that was a nightmare and a half trying to figure everything out. You can take it down now. Ms. Wong, does this account accord with the experience of your members?
Very much so.
I'm going to ask you a bit more now about elective home education. At paragraphs 56 and 57 of your statement, you discuss elective home education. Can you just tell us what that is?
Okay, so, I mean, it implies that someone's chosen to educate their children. I mean, I think for many of our families, they had never considered this as an option previously. I think everyone remembers parents complaining about teaching their children at home and the difficulties that they faced over a number of weeks in the early pandemic. However, you know, you're talking about people who have sometimes very serious health conditions, who were forced into this position where there was no safe option for their child to be educated through kind of a formal system. They'd never chosen this before. They were unwilling homeschoolers, you could perhaps say. Some of them may have enjoyed it, and so it's not true that that there aren't people who didn't find that suited them. But you know, I think for many of these people, this was a choice that they didn't choose to make.
It was something motivated by safety, is that
Absolutely.
what you're saying? Yes, okay. I'd like to take you now to the elective home education survey carried out by the Association of Directors of Children's Services. The reference is INQ 000560894. And the survey relates to the 2020-2021 academic year, and it invited local authorities to indicate how many children were educated at home and for what reason. And if we see here this table on page 5 of the survey report, it shows that the reasons for elective home education in that period, which was the height of the pandemic, the biggest reason was health concerns relating specifically to COVID. Is that right?
Yes, but I would just say that it's not clearly necessarily always us, and we may have fallen into the health and emotional health category, or parents didn't give a reason, or however they decided to classify that group. It's not a kind of a formal classification because of the way that evidence is gathered.
Yes.
So I think it's not fully clear, but it is clear that that was suddenly a new bar that was added to their graph.
It was a new major reason.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. We can take that down. Thank you very much. You refer in your statement to a lack of flexibility in the attendance guidelines issued to schools and the impacts of this on children and young people's access to education. When you mention flexibility, what do you mean by that?
So flexibility could mean a number of different things. It might mean, obviously, learning remotely as a potential. It might mean hybrid learning. And by hybrid learning, I mean in class to an extent, but maybe in an outdoor classroom. They have things like forest schools for younger children. So there are ways of doing things whereby you might be able to, and maybe you can do your PE lesson outside, because that, and you can be distance or whatever, but you can do things relatively safely. A hybrid option is an option that doesn't seem to have ever really been considered. And then, perhaps working from home, for things that were less safe.
I see. You refer in your statement to a local authority that adopted a more flexible approach, and that was Hampshire Council. Before we go to the guidance itself, which we will do in a moment, how did it come about that Hampshire County Council developed separate guidance for attendance?
Yes, well, we find this really interesting, actually, and I think it's very key for the inquiry to consider. One of our members, Severely Immunized First Family, was highly at risk, and they had been threatened with fines and prosecution. They were alert to kind of these issues, and they were also legally supported. So normally you wouldn't have anyone in attendance at a fines panel hearing, but they actually had lawyers who turned up on that day and spoke on their behalf and explained the risks that family had faced. And suddenly, and I believe the next day, this guidance emerged, which actually addressed, I think, pretty much all of the things that would have been on our wish list.
Okay, and when you say that the parent involved was
Yes.
severely immunosuppressed, so can I take it that they were in the clinically extremely vulnerable group?
Yes, and they would remain in the current vaccination group. So as I said, there's been a shift in vaccinations today. So they would still be in that highest risk group.
Okay. And we can turn to the guidance now. It's INQ 000587993. On page 25 of the guidance. It states the Department for Education guidance states that attendance is mandatory unless a child is clinically extremely vulnerable, even if the family member is clinically extremely vulnerable. And then it notes at the bottom, the guidance states that the usual powers of intervention, such as warning notices, penalty notices, and prosecution remain in place. However, following a number of individual cases that have come to our attention, we are amending our guidance to head teachers as follows. Consideration needs to be given on a case-by-case basis. If a parent provides a consultant-level letter clearly stating that the attendance at school of a child in the household would endanger the life of a parent or a sibling, a member of that household, through the transmission of COVID-19, then the absence should be recorded as authorized. And in that circumstance, remote learning should be made available. And if a child has been removed from the role, the school should contact the parents to explain the changed approach. And that any penalty notices can be withdrawn. You described a moment ago that this guidance was everything that would be on your wish list. Is that right?
Well, almost.
Almost.
Pretty much. And I think I want to just, if I may, highlight where it says if a parent provides a consultant level letter, clearly stating, and then it says that the member of the household would be at risk through transmission of COVID-19, then they could support them. Where it says clinically extremely vulnerable people, it's in the name, it's in the name, clinically vulnerable, they were at risk. So we had people who were clinically vulnerable who were able to get the same letter, who were informed through us that this thing existed, this evidence existed, who were able to support their families. However, it put a huge burden on doctors who we know shouldn't have been pressured at that time. It was a manual process that was completely unnecessary. And all of these families were recognised at risk. And so we do question this. Plus also, there's still a question about sharing some very private medical details with your school. I don't think people should have had to give away those personal details.
Okay. Do you agree that this guidance is a departure from Department for Education guidance requiring all children to return to school?
Completely.
Okay. Do you consider that the DFE guidance had a reasonable objective, and that is getting children to attend school in person?
Okay, so speaking as a professional, as a teacher, I fully support in-person education. I don't want to come across as anything but that. In-person education, children will learn more, achieve more, they can access teaching and resources. My background is science teaching, and so to be able to take part in a science practical is very different from watching a YouTube video of that same practical. So in-person teaching is what we would all hope to aim for. However, if people's lives are at risk and health at risk, and so it's perhaps some of the clinically vulnerable children may not have died. However, if they went to ICU or had other serious complications, long-term effects, they're much higher risk of long COVID as well. They can't afford to gamble with their health, So I do have kind of concerns around that.
Okay. Just taking this guidance for a moment, which allows for a consultant level letter, which states that somebody in the household would be there'd be a risk to their life with the transmission of COVID. Do you agree that until the vaccination program was sufficiently advanced, that there would have been quite a large number of families in which it could be said that there was a risk to the life of a family member from contracting COVID?
Absolutely. But then equally, if you would say that all children were locked down, and supported at a certain point in time, and yet we weren't willing to support at a different point in time where maybe the pressure on the NHS, the system's pressure was different. We weren't supporting those individuals who still carried those high risks, for whom their individual risk hadn't changed because vaccines hadn't kind of rolled out. At a time when we knew that the vaccine was on its way. This was a period of time that needed to be managed, and it wasn't.
Okay. Do you accept that given the importance for children of being in school, that it was appropriate for the Department for Education to ensure that children who the CMO had advised were not at materially increased risk were required to attend school?
Sorry, do you mind just repeating that?
Of course. Do you accept that given the importance of children being in school, that it was appropriate for the Department for Education to ensure that children who the CMO felt were not at materially increased risk from COVID were required to attend school?
I would challenge that notion. Again, those children in the Green Book guidance, where it explains what clinical vulnerability is, they are listed in a table as being at higher risk. So to suggest that they were not at materially increased risk, why were they prioritised for vaccination? Clearly they were at higher risk. And I think that there are different elements to risk, and I agree that somebody who's a 90-year-old with multiple conditions is at much greater risk than a child. I mean, we have plenty of evidence to support that. However, and you can talk about QALYs and DALYs and things like that as well. But for those families to risk their child, it's unthinkable. And this was a choice that they had to make. There was a possibility of a route out. Why would they not be biding their time? Precautionary principle, protecting their child. Why didn't the government do that and protect those children that were recognised at high risk?
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to another topic, which is the main challenges facing CV and CEV children and young people as a result of the pandemic. I'm going to begin with education. CVF conducted a survey of 350 of its members since schools reopened in 2020, and the findings are set out in a document. We don't need to pull it up, but it's INQ 000588194. Oh, well, here it is. So this shows persistent absences in 2021, 2022. And we see here a table for CV, a bar in the graph for CV families. And that is 80% persistent absences in that school year. And this is the result of the survey that you conducted, is that right?
Yes, it was. And you can see the pre-pandemic norms also on that graph. So, I mean, actually, it turned out, and it was quite interesting to see, that the pre-pandemic norms for clinically vulnerable children and children in clinically vulnerable families overall was not far off the national average before the pandemic.
Yes. And then if we move now to figure 7, I think, in that report, which is INQ 000588195. These are the figures for severe absences in 2021, 2022. And we can see here, again, CV families with a rate much higher than the other groups and all pupils at about 33 or 34% there. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I just explain what those things are?
Yes,
so
of course.
Persistent absences for those who are not in education is an absence of 10% of their school time, their education time. Severe absence are those children who are off school 50% or more of their time.
So that would mean that of these 33% of children in CV families, that they were missing school for quite a considerable period of time every year.
Yes.
Okay. What more could have been done to ensure that more CV and CEV children and those in households with CV members attended education? We would advocate for safety as our biggest concern. We don't feel that the government prepared for an airborne pandemic. We don't feel that the measures that were in place in schools at the time provided reassurance to those parents who understood the transmission risk of an airborne virus. And so safer schools would have reduced everyone's risk and perhaps made it easier for certain families to return to school. But also flexibility. There should have been a choice to have been, legally forced to remove your child from school or face fines, prosecutions, children's services. There was no real option for these families. And those children were not taught. And it has had severe consequences for those who have been impacted. And there are still children who remain at higher risk. And you're probably aware that there's a wave of COVID right now.
And so for those families, particularly when cases get high, when they feel under pressure, then it's very, very difficult for them because they're not supported in schools. They're not supported to stay safe. And wearing a mask has been quite politicised. And wear any other kind of protective gear that a child might wear in school. They might wear shin pads. They might wear goggles in science. Those things are not politicised. But for a vulnerable child or a vulnerable family, a child in a vulnerable family to choose to wear a mask is seen as a safeguarding concern sometimes, which is a real worry for us.
I see. I'm going to ask you now about the impact on mental health. I'd like to take you again to the Children and Young Persons Voices report. And we're looking here at paragraph 3.7.2.15. So children and young people also describe being affected by feelings of anxiety about the risk of infection when returning to school. These could be triggered by being around so many other people, touching things other people had touched, using the toilets at school, using transport to get to school. Some children and young people also felt at risk from other students coming to school unwell, and that their needs were not being taken into account. And then there's an account here from a child, age 14. I think it was a bit of I want to go back to school, but how do I know if someone's not going to kill me? How did CVF members express their concerns about their children's mental health to you?
So, I mean, they were facing an impossible situation. And many families did choose to, in the same way as I was explaining, in-person education is really important. Our families did support that. That's why their children were registered in schools. So there were children who were attending schools in high-risk environments with unaddressed risks, and they had legitimate concerns. It wasn't anxiety that was just being anxious. The term anxiety has been kind of used against us. Fear frequently as well. But, you know, these children were facing and managing much higher risks than the other children. And nobody was supporting them. Nobody understood what they were trying to manage. I would say there was a new group of young carers that emerged during this time who, again, were not recognised. They were trying their best to stay safe. And I think the thing that I would really like the inquiry to take on board is that this was a new situation. Suddenly we could test for this virus. Suddenly people could know that they'd been infected. So a child would come home, they'd be symptomatic, and they knew that they posed a risk to a vulnerable household member. And if they took a test and they tested positive, they not only carried that real legitimate fear that they might kill their loved one, in some cases they did, and they knew it.
Yeah. Your statement sets out some of the challenges faced by children living with family members who are CV and CEV. I think you've told us about new carers, you say, being created in this situation. Can you tell us, do you mean children who now had a responsibility to care for clinically vulnerable family members in terms of not catching the infection? Is that what you meant, or did you mean something else?
I meant in many ways, actually. So, obviously, you know, times of lockdown, things like that. Children who may have taken on caring responsibilities that would kind of be more recognised as within the standard understanding of what caring is. Suddenly, because other carers were not available who might have provided support, so they might not have tipped over into that kind of category of requiring. But you know, because of health conditions or whatever, perhaps they had to help to go to the shops or to the pharmacy or something like that. Perhaps they had to help because some people were quite worried about cleaning food early on when we were told it was phonemic transmission. So there were lots of things that children suddenly had to take responsibilities. They had to help to support their other siblings who were homeschooling. There were lots of kind of responsibilities that kind of came to those children. But then there was the other group that was in school who were facing these risks and challenges that were not being recognised, and that is the group that I think, in particular, nobody really understood that they were carrying this huge burden, and nobody knew what they were managing, and the school guidance was actively against them. It said that if you have a clinically vulnerable or a clinically extremely vulnerable family member, that you still had to be in school, and that the head teacher should reassure them.
I'd like to bring up now a account from the Every Story Matters report, and it's INQ 0005880022, page 134. And that second account there, with carers, especially young ones, it was drummed into them that if you were going to meet with someone, you're going to kill them, the person that they cared for. We were lucky because we got a change of scenery by coming to work. But for young carers that were pinging in and out of lockdowns, they were saying things like, if I go to school, I could kill my brother. Does that accord with the views expressed by your members of the impact on young carers in CVF families?
Okay, I need to kind of unpick this statement, if you don't mind.
Certainly.
Okay, so for a start, I'm not really sure who this person is and whether they've got a professional background, or it's not clear who they are, or even who they're talking about. So where they're talking about young carers, so it kind of might confuse people between disability and clinical vulnerability. And so clinical vulnerability, as you know, this particular list, these people who qualified for vaccines, disability might be somebody who has got physical impairment, but might not have a condition, a chronic condition or whatever that puts them in that increased risk category. And so I don't know who they're talking about. If they are talking about people who were in a clinically vulnerable family, they're talking about returning to work and additional lockdowns that children were facing. Again, it doesn't kind of ring true with me, because actually children had less lockdowns than adults. There were only 2 lockdowns that children faced, the initial one and the one 2021 January. And so, whereas adults had an additional one in between. And so, again, I don't understand that. But certainly, the risks, I mean, the point that you're kind of driving at, the risks that they face, the feeling about, bringing home an infection that could kill their loved one is, yes, very true.
Thank you. Finally, I'm going to ask you about the impact on children and young people's physical health, and focusing particularly here on missed medical appointments. In your statement, you describe how medical environments were generally unsafe for CV families, which led to missed appointments. Can I ask you to take a look at an extract here from a report funded by the National Institute for Health Research? So it's INQ 0006480066. We're looking here at figure 8 on page 19. So this is a report funded, as I said, by the National Institute for Health Research, examining changes in hospital contacts during the pandemic among vulnerable children and young people. In this study, vulnerable did not refer to clinical vulnerability to COVID-19. It considered children 0 to 4 years with a chronic health condition, or who were born prematurely or had a low birth weight. So there will be some overlap with children who are clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable. It's not exactly coextensive.
I would say that perhaps that's a matter of terminology. I think that there may well be evidence that children with a low birth rate might be at high risk, but I haven't seen that evidence. I can't comment on that.
Yeah.
But certainly those with a chronic health condition may well, almost likely to fall
within that group.
Yes.
Figure 8 shows that there were 594 outpatient attendances less than expected per 1,000 children in a year from March 23rd to December 21st, 2020. So that represents a significant reduction in outpatient care for those children. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
And does that accord with the experience of CVF members?
Very much so, and it applied not just for children who were vulnerable themselves, but also children in vulnerable households. Obviously, it was seen as an incredibly high-risk environment. It was a high-risk environment. You know, they were a high-risk group, and what could they do? They had to make decisions that were very difficult, and unfortunately, they were not targeted. Like, you know, this evidence is here, but what did they do to support these children? How did they help them to protect this particularly high-risk group who had these chronic conditions? Why weren't they doing more to support them safely?
Yeah. In conclusion, we haven't gone into each of the case studies that you helpfully set out in your statement. But standing back, what conclusions can be drawn from them about government decision-making, about clinically vulnerable families during the pandemic?
So I think for us, safety should be seen as a basic right. You know, and the hierarchy of controls should have considered, you know, our needs. We should have put those things in place, and the precautionary principle should have been applied for our families. We're concerned that we're not addressed in the Equality Act, and where I briefly explained earlier regarding the difference between clinical vulnerability and disability, there is definitely crossover. There's no doubt. I mean, I myself would fall under the disabled category. However, it's about impairments, physical impairments and mental impairments, and addressing those impairments, and not about the risk that those people face from pathogens. And so it's a different issue. And even where people were covered under the Equality Act, they were not supported. So those children did suffer, and they were not recognised, and their needs were not addressed, and they had no obvious way of being sort of feeding back into this. And I believe that those families should have been given choice. There should have been another option that would enable schools to safeguard those children so that they had contact. So perhaps they did some in-person outdoor learning, but also for them to do that safely, for them to interact with their peers. And, you know, where the risks were too high, then, you know, remote learning, which was offered to all children at certain points, was offered to the children with COVID, should have been also an option for our children and families. And I would ask for the government to consider a remote school, because it's something that not just in a situation of a pandemic, but in epidemics and in other circumstances where children are absent from schools for long periods. You know, to have a remote school is not the best solution, but it is better than nothing. And that's what these children were left with. And so for children who were missing education, and, you know, some of those were in critical exam years, they were unable to get the grades that they need, or in some cases were unable to get any grades at all. And so that has a massive, I can't underline it enough, consequence for their future. Can I give an example, if I may?
Yes, give an example.
So there's in fact, Mr. Wagner, KC, our barrister, explained earlier on that one of our members called Lana, she took her GCSEs in that school year. I can't remember which year it was, sorry, maybe 2021, not sure. And she was a bright child. She was very able. And she was refused online learning. She taught herself all of her subjects. She was a capable child. She got a grade 7 in her English, which is an A in old money. You know, but she could have got higher. She could have got an 8 or a 9 if she had had teaching. She couldn't teach herself maths. It's very difficult to teach yourself maths, incredibly difficult. And so she missed her maths GCSE grade to pass. She's not sure, 1 or 2 marks. No consideration was given to her. No support was given to her. The National Tutoring Programme did not support our children or highlight them, despite them facing these serious challenges. And so she wanted to go into science as a career. And again, as I was explaining earlier, you have to be able to take those practicals. You have to be in class. So you have to have the support from your teacher. She did not receive any support from her school. And so she wasn't able to continue on that line. And so her future has been harmed. I don't want to say irreparably, because she's a bright girl. She will find a path. But she should not have been put in that position.
Yes.
It was completely avoidable. And many children are like that. And there are children who were unable to take their exams at all because they were in those years. And you can't go back and take your GCSEs. You can take your maths and your English to probably a basic level with a class full of kids who didn't do very well the first time round. So your chances of getting a high grade are quite low. So like I said, this has serious consequences, not just some point in the past, but it's living with these children right now and going on into the future. And I would really ask the inquiry to consider those long-term harms as well.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
My lady, there aren't any additional questions for this witness.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Wong. I had a message earlier that you weren't feeling great this morning, but I hope there's no sign of it now, so I hope we haven't exacerbated your condition. Are you all right now?
I'm probably too much of a fighter.
Was it adrenaline that got you through, probably?
Yeah, something like that.
I'm a great believer in adrenaline getting you through difficult
Thank you.
situations. So thank you very much indeed for coming, for your
Thank you
help.
for the opportunity.
Struggling on,
Appreciate
despite
it.
the fact you felt poorly.
No worries.
Thank you. I think we're going to go to the next witness now. Thank you very much.
My lady, may I please call Dr. Rebecca Montacute?
That's repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and
affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Sorry for keep you waiting till the last witness of the day, Dr.
Okay,
Montacute.
thanks.
Thank you. Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Dr. Rebecca Montacute.
Thank you. And I think you ought to have 2 witness statements in front of you. One of them is INQ 000587969. Do you have that?
Yep.
And I think that's a statement signed by Mr. Carl Cullinane. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think you ought also to have a second witness statement, INQ 000588185. Yes?
Yes.
And is that a statement that you've signed adopting the contents of Mr. Cullinane's statement?
Yes.
And can you confirm that the contents of Mr. Cullinane's statement are true to the best of your knowledge
Yes.
and belief? And to explain, you're here to give evidence on behalf of the Sutton Trust, is that right?
Yes, correct.
And Dr. Montacute, I think it's correct that you joined the Trust in 2017
Yes, correct.
and you became its head of research and policy.
Yes.
But you are now, I think, the Director of Research at the Social Market Foundation.
Yes, correct.
But you're authorised to give evidence on behalf of the Sutton Trust.
Yes.
All right, well, just going back then to some of your work there, I think it's correct that one of the principal areas of work of the Sutton Trust is to research and address barriers that young people face from their early years right up until employment. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
And I think that during the pandemic, it carried on doing its research into that work. Is that right?
Yes, correct. And we pivoted a really large proportion of that work into studying the impacts of the pandemic.
And was all of that work then funneled into what's known as the COSMO study?
So it was a combination. At the very beginning of the pandemic, we did our own just Sutton Trust internal pieces, looking at the immediate impact and doing some kind of quicker turnaround polling of smaller populations to try to get really speedy looks at what was happening to young people. And then later on, together with colleagues at UCL, we then bid for and got the funding for the COSMO study, and then the subsequent work with the much larger population was done through that study.
Yes. So I'll touch on your polling in just a second, but just focusing, if I may, on the COSMO study. I think it's correct that in 2021 you identified a large sample of young people who were then aged 15 to 16. Is that
Yes,
right?
correct.
And how many young people were in that sample?
It was just under 13,000.
And in your explanation of the study, you say that it was nationally representative. Is that right?
Yes, so we did a technique to kind of divide the population into lots of different groups, and then within those groups randomly sampling to be able to get as good a kind of coverage over the whole of that population as possible. We also oversampled for certain populations, so for instance private schools, because we thought that they may have particular experiences of the pandemic.
And I think it's also correct, and I should clarify, when you say nationally representative, is that representative of England as opposed to the whole of the United
Yes,
Kingdom?
England.
And are you able to say whether or not, nonetheless, that sample that you selected are probably representative of the United Kingdom or not?
So it depends in part that education has devolved to the different nations. So a lot of the responses that happened during the pandemic will have differed when it comes to that. So there will be ways in which different nations will have differed that we weren't able to look at in that study. I will say, though, that I'd expect a lot of the divides we saw in the study, so I'm sure we'll get on to this, but for instance, the home learning environment students would have had in to kind of learn remotely, those social economic differences probably were repeated in the different nations, but we don't have data to really look at it at the same level of depth.
I understand. And another, what you've also said as regards this study, that it had a robust methodology as well. I don't need you to go into very much detail about that, but could you provide the inquiry with a headline as to why it was regarded as robust?
Yeah, so a large part of it is just the sample size, so having just under 13,000 young people, and we did also survey about 9,000 parents of those young people as well, covering about 500 different schools over the country means that you've got the numbers needed to be able to do a lot of splits by different groups. So for instance, being able to look at different social economic groups, the kind of occupations people's parents did, ethnicity, gender, and having the numbers to really feel quite secure in those findings.
And I think then just again focusing on these children, we've said they're 15 to 16. This may be obvious, but are those young people who would have been doing their GCSEs then in 2021?
Yes, so they should have sat their GCSE exams in that summer of 2021.
Okay, that's helpful. So they were young people that, had everything been as normal, they would have done their exams, say, in and around May or June 2021?
Yes.
So those are young people who would have experienced then the disruption of those exams at that stage.
Yes, exactly. And I should say, when we first designed the study, we actually did think that they might sit those exams. So part of the reason for choosing that year group was that they'd had this really large amount of disruption at a really pivotal transition point for them before they go into post-16. But we were hopeful that they would have sat actual exams. Now that is not what ended up actually happening. They also had to have a different version of a way to be able to determine their grades.
Yes, I'll ask you about that shortly.
Yep.
And then just finally this, you followed, I think, the same group of young people then again in 2022, is that right?
Let me just double check exactly when the two sets were that we actually...
If it helps you, I think you'll find it at paragraph 1.114.
I think I've also got a set in here somewhere. Yes, so the first wave of the study was done in between October 2021 and March 2022. And then the second wave was done in October 2022 to February 2023.
And was part of the reason for doing the follow-up study to try and understand a bit more about the longer-term impacts as to what had happened on those children
Yes,
in regard to
exactly.
the year? Can I turn then to just some of the points that you make, and this is from paragraph 2.2 onwards in your statement, if that assists. I think that as far as the Sutton Trust is concerned, it's examination results that are really the key thing for addressing attainment. Is that right?
I'm not quite sure what you mean, sorry.
I think because you say at paragraph 22.2 that it's that examination results are the key challenge. So that's one of the key aspects of what needs to be addressed. Is that right?
I'd say exam results are one of the best indications and available indications that we have for what any of the impact has been of this, disruption. Once they were actually sat exams later on, and we can look at the impact of the attainment gap long term. Exams don't tell you everything about a young person's development, their ability. They're a very specific look at one point in time. So I wouldn't say they are, they're not everything. I think it's important to bear in mind, but they are one of the best measures that we've got.
Forgive me, I didn't mean to put it that broadly.
Yep.
I think it's just in terms of understanding them as a useful measurement. And I think you explain in your statement that GCSEs are in fact probably one of the most useful gauges that you've got, rather
Yes.
than A-levels, for example.
So GCSEs are useful because the whole cohort take them, whereas A-levels, you're already losing a lot of young people from lower income backgrounds because they haven't gone on to study them.
Thank you. And just very briefly then, I think one of the things you say that, and this is at paragraph 2.4, is that prior to the pandemic, disadvantaged students were twice as likely to leave school without GCSEs in English and maths. Is that correct?
Yes, although it is important to bear in mind that gap had been very slowly closing before the pandemic.
Well, precisely, that's what I had just wanted to check, that it had been a closing gap.
Yes.
And I think as well that you make the point too that even children who are high achieving in primary school, when it comes to outcomes at secondary school, that they were 20 percentage points behind. Is that also right?
So the 20 percentage points is the overall attainment gap for everyone. We have done separate work looking at high attainers specifically. I can't remember off the top of my head what the difference is for that group.
Don't worry. I think we have the point then, that
Yep.
that's the overall percentage. And I think that one of the other points that you draw out in your statement is that when we're looking at some of the issues that we'll move on to, that these are not binary issues, for example, as between provision in private schools and provision in state schools, that there can be gaps within the state school sector as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the attainment gap results will only be for children in state schools anyway, because that's what the Department for Education release. But there are considerable, I'm not going to say that 100%. I'm pretty certain off the top of my head that is only for state schools. But yes, there are considerable differences within the state sector as well as between the state and private sectors.
And then just moving on, if I can, then to the polling that you carried out, or that the Sutton Trust carried out. I think you have this from paragraph 2.10. that the Sutton Trust moved quite quickly after school closures were announced to undertake some initial research. Is that right?
Yeah, so the very first piece that we released was in very early April, and the first piece with polling data, I think, a week or two after that.
So I think you explained that this, in fact, was polling that you did in the first week of school closures. Is that right?
Yes, very early on we did polling of teachers through TeacherTapp to try to understand the immediate impact on what they were seeing from their pupils.
And what you set out at paragraph 2.11 is that one of the early points that you noted was that in more deprived areas, schools were using worksheets rather than setting work online. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So does that mean sending children a physical page to fill in, or giving them a project or something like that to do?
Exactly, and a lot of teachers were physically going out to students' houses to deliver those worksheets. And sometimes they would do that as also a welfare check. And at various points, they were delivering food from the school because some of these children would rely on the school for their school lunch. So some of the schools would physically go and deliver it to pupils and give them the worksheets at the same time.
And this early polling also indicated that there were emerging issues about children's access to technology as well. Is that right?
Yes, so we asked teachers what proportion of their classes were unable, in their view, to kind of access either the technology or the internet to be able to do work remotely. And we found both divides between the state and private sector, and also in the deprivation level of the state schools for the populations they serve.
And I think that the conclusion that was drawn was that 42% of teachers in private schools thought that all of their students would have adequate access, compared to 9% in the most well-off state schools and 2% in the poorest state schools. That's at paragraph 2.14.
Yes, that's correct.
And then, I'm going to move forward in your statement. Those were the early indications. But if we go forward to paragraph 4.3, have you got that? Were you then able to confirm what the picture looked like during the first lockdown?
Yeah, so this data in 4.3 is then from the Cosmos study with that much larger population later on. I will say that one of the limitations of the Cosmos study is that even though it was still relatively fresh for the young people, they were having to remember back to their experiences. So you've got a benefit from it being directly the young people themselves giving their assessment of what they did or didn't have. But the earlier polling with the teachers was fresh at the time,
yes.
But then it was their kind of sense of what they thought their pupils had.
All right, so this is young people if we look at 4.3, or your conclusion based on what young people in the study said.
Yes.
That almost a quarter of those at state comprehensives within the most deprived intakes didn't have access to a suitable device.
Yes, exactly.
So that's really important, isn't it? It's within the most deprived areas. It's not all children within the state sector.
Yes.
And in general terms, may I ask whether those, I suppose if we take the TeacherTapp polling, whether or not that would have been consistent with what the Sutton Trust expected to find, or whether it was surprising?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, we asked the question to teachers because we did think that there was going to be an issue. I'm not sure if I think when I saw the data of the extent that I was surprised or not. It was certainly a worry. And there was previous data on social economic inequalities and access to devices and the internet at home. But I can't really remember how surprised I was by the extent.
All right, well, I don't want to ask you questions that you can't answer. So I'm going to move on. I think that it's right that after this data came in, that the Sutton Trust then approached the Department for Education and specifically, I think, drew, or certainly sought to draw to Sir Gavin Williamson's attention that these sorts of findings were emerging. Is that
Yes,
broadly
that's correct. And this data was also reported on in the media, like relatively widely at the time, so it would have been known. But we did also directly get in contact with Gavin Williamson.
Dr. Montague, I'm going to pause there, if I may, because I think it's a break time, if I'm right.
Yes, if that's a convenient time. You've probably been alerted to the fact we take regular breaks, and so I'm sorry to interrupt your evidence. We're doing quite well on timing. I should be generous. So 25 past, please. Ms. Dobbin.
Thank you. Dr. Montague, before the adjournment, you had just given evidence about, and looking at paragraph 4.3, of your statement. And I just wanted to move on to what you had said at paragraph 4.4. So 4.3 was about children not having a device, but I think the point that you were making at 4.4 was that there was also an issue about children sharing devices. Is that correct?
Yes, so in some households, even where children did have access to a device, it might be that they were sharing it with their parents who were using it for work as well, or they might be sharing with one or multiple siblings.
And I think what you say there is that, and again, I take it this is based on the Cosmo data.
Yes.
Thank you. That 13% of young people reported needing to share a device in lockdown 1, and that fell to 9% in lockdown 3, so in the second set of school closures.
Yes, correct.
And again, just looking at some disparities, that there was 13% of those children at state comprehensive schools reported that, as compared to 4% of children at independent schools. Yes?
Yes.
And then what you go on to also set out at paragraph 4.7 is the correlation between access, this may not be surprising, and the ability of children or the amount of time they spent at their work, at their schoolwork. Is that right?
Yes, so we asked questions to the young people about the number of hours that they spent being able to work during both of the lockdowns. And as it says there was a relationship between that, having access to a device and the amount of time that they were able to spend, and whether or not they used a laptop or a mobile phone.
Yes. And I think we'll come on and look at some of those specific figures in just a second. And then just to conclude this bit of your evidence, I think if you look at paragraph 3 of your statement, you set out some other disparities. And these relate to the sorts of provision that was being made online. Is that correct? If we look, for example, at paragraph 3.7. Have you got that?
3.7?
Yes.
I've got 3.5 and then it goes to 4. Is it in a different part that I'm looking at, maybe?
That sounds like, well, this may not be controversial, so let me ask you and see. It sounds like you might have a pagination issue, so let me just ask. That in that bit of your evidence, it referred to the fact that 96% of independent schools had live online lessons compared to 65% of state schools. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And are you able to say, and it may be that the data doesn't break down this far and you may not know, whether that meant that 65% of children in state schools were getting the equivalent of a full day's teaching by live lessons, or was it something different?
No, I'm quite certain the question was just if they had any setup for live lessons at all. So that still could have meant it was only an hour, 2 hours, maybe it was, just part of the day. I think from memory, we didn't split it down in those questions between private and state of how long they were doing, I think.
All right, so this is just about the bold question of whether you have
yes, I think so.
Live lessons or not. And I think it's also correct that, again, you found that there was a division between more affluent state schools and less affluent state schools as well. Is that correct?
Yes, but I should clarify it's about the affluence of the intake of the school. So it's not about the money or resources available to the school itself. It's what is the income background of the children that go to those schools.
Forgive me, that's such an important point, and I should have asked you to explain that. Are these, when you describe schools as being affluent, is that because they're in an area that is regarded as affluent, having regard to certain markers?
It's based on the proportion of children in that school who are eligible for free school meals.
And again, so we see that divide once more, is that correct, within
Yes.
the state sector itself? And another differential that you measured or you found as well was contact that children were having with a teacher, is that
Yes.
right? And what you found was that contact with a teacher rose in the January school closure, so 2021, and this was contact once a week, from 45% to 53%. Is
Yes.
that correct? And do you recall whether that's across the board in all schools, or whether children who were at private provision had slightly more contact than that?
I think the contact was higher in private schools, and where it will have risen between the lockdowns, I think it was across the board for these kind of measures, state schools catching up a bit but not getting to the same level, which makes sense. They had a bit more time at that point to be able to sort out what they were doing. And I think it is really important to stress that in the first lockdown, state schools, and particularly those with very deprived intakes, sometimes because they were having to spend so much time worrying about if children were, say, even getting food, you know, that was a lot of the time teachers' primary concern, rather than necessarily are we able to sort out live lessons for them or that kind of thing. Whereas I think by the second set of school closures, more of those schools would have, because there had been more time to figure out those sorts of issues and have voucher systems for free school meals and all those sorts of things that were put in place, they then had a bit more time, capacity, ability to spend more time on sorting out contact lessons, those kind of issues.
And that the term that you've used, contact with a teacher, I had assumed that meant maybe speaking to a teacher over the phone or online. Is that what it means?
I think it was a combination of that, and probably potentially also if they were still doing any in-person visits, and I'm not sure to the extent throughout the pandemic that continued or not for teachers.
But I think in any event, what you went on to conclude was that children who were at private schools were more likely to be in touch with a teacher once a week. Is that correct? And can I ask you, we've touched on, we've very much focused thus far on remote education and access to technology. Did the Sutton Trust assess or analyse the other sorts of factors that children might experience that impeded their access to education?
Yes, so we also looked at issues like the kind of housing that children were living in. I believe we had questions around kind of if they had certain kind of problems around their housing conditions. I can't remember offhand, but that may have been from the parents being asked. I would imagine they would have been more accurate in being able to talk about any of those issues. But I think we also explored some of those underlying issues around kind of cramped housing, how many people were living in a house, whether, you know, and that will impact on how likely someone is to have a quiet space to learn in. We did also ask directly about the kind of, if they did have somewhere quiet to be able to spend their kind of working time in as well.
Thank you. And I think if we just then come to the key conclusion, I think, that you've drawn, which is set out at paragraph, I hope, at 3.14 of your statement.
I thought you went from 3.4 to 4.
3.14.
You got it right.
Yep.
Well, can I ask, is that the key conclusion that ultimately the Sutton Trust drew, that the attainment gap between children from lower socio-economic backgrounds and their peers had widened considerably since the pandemic?
Yes. I mean, I will say in the 10 years before, the progress at closing the gap, so that 10 years of progress I've said have been wiped out, it was slow progress because it is a very hard issue to tackle, but it is the progress made over the period of 10 years, which was very hard fought for essentially throughout the education system that we've seen a reversal of.
And has the, I appreciate you've left the Sutton Trust now, and if you can't answer this, please say, but does the Sutton Trust assess that although progress was made very slowly in that 10-year period, that recovery has been quicker than that post the pandemic? I hope that question
Do you mean
makes sense.
has the attainment gap started to close again?
Yes, and is the rate at which it's closing faster as well?
No, so I believe the data is for the latest year of data that it has stayed broadly similar, that the gap that has now re-widened doesn't seem to be particularly closing.
And I think we have some up-to-date statistics in your statement, because I think you've set out at paragraph 3.19 that at Key Stage 4, so at GCSEs, 25.2% of disadvantaged pupils achieved 5 and above in English and Maths GCSEs. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is what you're saying that has remained broadly the same
Yes.
to date? Obviously, that compares then to the figure you set out at the start
Yes.
of your evidence. With that, I'll move on then, if I may, to some of the Cosmo briefings. And I was going to start with the COVID social mobility briefing, which is INQ 000587926, page 1.
Do you know which number it is in this pack?
Tab 6.
Yeah. Oh, perfect, yeah.
So to introduce these briefings, these represent the work that you were doing at the time and the principal findings that you were making within the Cosmo study. Is that right?
Yes, so this is work which was colleagues from the Sutton Trust and also from UCL.
Yes, of course, I should say it involved academics
Yes.
as well. And just looking at this, some of this you've already covered in your statement, but I think at the bottom of that it does set out the figures that you mentioned about the breakdown in terms of access to a device. So I think we see at the very bottom of the column on the left-hand side that those without a device worked on average 8 hours a week in lockdown 1, so just over an hour a day. Those with a phone, 10 hours, and those with a laptop or tablet, 14 hours.
Yes.
May I just ask, if the children with the greatest amount of access were working 14 hours a week, would that of itself have been of concern to the Sutton Trust?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yes, if children with the most amount of access to remote education because they had a laptop
Yes.
were working for 14 hours a week, so that's under 2 hours, well, it's a bit over 2 hours a day, isn't it? Would that figure of itself have been concerning to the Sutton Trust?
Yes, and I do think that is a really important point. A lot of this data, we've really pulled out the social economic differences because as an organisation, that is the Sutton Trust's kind of primary concern. But even for those that had the best access, they wouldn't be getting what they would have in a classroom. It won't be directly transferable because obviously times that you have in a classroom, you spend time going between lessons, talking to your friends, you're not always kind of working, and we don't know what the quality of this work was like. And I imagine that some might have been more focused than what you would do, but maybe in shorter bursts, but we don't totally know.
But I think you've made the point, which may be important, that these figures are a sort of universal reflection, in a sense, across all of the types of children that took part in the study.
Yes.
And I think as well what the diagram to the right of this also indicates is that you can break down, in terms of children attending online classes a day, you can break it down by reference to occupation as well.
Yes.
And I think what may be important here is that you can compare the first set of school closures to the second set.
Yes, and this data is actually particularly interesting because it's slightly different than what we've seen in some of the other findings comparing the two periods of lockdown. In that actually, in the first lockdown for this measure, it was much more consistent across parental occupation background as to how many lessons people were attending. And actually, it's in the second, once more kind of schools are able to set up more, that you've actually seen a bigger difference on this measure. And that will depend, you do see some differences on those measures because, you know, whilst some students will now have gotten set up on devices, a tool, say, or be able to interact with anything, being able to do more than 3 online classes per day is quite a high level of access. So it's not just about, are people accessing it at all? Sometimes you only see the social economic differences when you're looking at the amount of access.
Yes. But again, do you think the inquiry, that this is an important point for the inquiry, because again, it reflects, even amongst those children who would be more affluent, that still there was a limited, or as you say, that it's a fairly universal picture in terms of what children were doing generally?
Yes, I do think it is important to point out that across social economic groups, people were having a very different experience. Although I will say, alongside all of, say, what a school was providing, you've also got to bear in mind that young people from lower social economic backgrounds will also have, on average, less support from their parents in terms of being able to assist with work, maybe do kind of wider discussions or reading with them or any of those kind of things. So school matters more for children who are from poorer families in general. So the combination of those families having less access and also them being in a worse place to start is, I think, also really important.
Right. So your evidence is you have to take a holistic view across the piece.
Yes.
About different things that might support a child's progress. And
yes, exactly.
And I think if we just go over the page, please, it's actually page 12.
Yes.
You should have it. This briefing also made the point, and it's the second bullet point, that there had been a lot of attention on younger children, but that the work that was being done indicated the barriers that 15 and 16-year-olds were facing. Is that right?
Yes, and our particular concern with that age group is that for those especially who didn't go on to A-levels subsequently, they will not have had time back in schools to be able to catch up at all on this time period. And as well as it being a time where they're making decisions about their post-16 kind of destinations, what they're going to do next, I think, you know, we don't understand well enough the impact on younger age groups, and there isn't a similar study to Cosmo for, say, primary age children during the pandemic. And that would be a really helpful thing to have exist and to understand over time if they are able to catch up on any of their lost learning. You know, the limitation is it's only this age group that we've got this really detailed information about shortly after the pandemic. What do they remember about their experiences?
And is it, before I move on to the next briefing, is it intended to do this study again with the same cohort to see what has happened?
If we're able to get funding for it, then yes. The idea would be that we would do subsequent waves later on during their adult life to understand longer term what actually has the impact been. So we could say this is how many hours a day this young person was able to learn in the pandemic. These were their wider experiences. And then this is what has happened to them in the workforce.
All right, I'm going to move on, if I may, and this is at your tab 9, and it's INQ 000587918, please. Now, first of all, would the Sutton Trust ordinarily ask questions about health or do work in this sort of sphere, or was this an innovation on its part?
This was new for the pandemic. So the reason that we thought it was important, it was a little bit of a combination. So longitudinal studies like this, with this many participants, don't come along very often. And this age group actually didn't have a longitudinal study kind of from birth for their cohort. So this is filling in a gap between other longitudinal studies, and I think was a part of the reason it was able to be funded, was to have those kind of wider benefits of understanding health for this group. But also, obviously, the pandemic is about health as well. And there are interactions between health and education. So we wanted to make sure that we understood that. No one in kind of the absolute core research team had a really explicit health background. I mean, I did a PhD in neuroscience, but it's we'd not done this kind of like population level stuff. But we did have an advisor as part of the wider Cosmo team who did have a health background. And so she would give us kind of her views when we were doing this work as to whether or not we were approaching it in the right way, kind of tips and ideas.
All right, and I think what you found, if we look, please, at the first bullet, is that between October 2021 and March 2022, almost half the children in this study they reported having
Yes.
COVID-19, is that correct? So this is what children told you, as opposed to, it's not based on a test result, for example, is that right?
Yes, and I think that's a really important point for this data to bear in mind in the interpretation, is all of this is their own definition, their own, them reporting. We haven't done any kind of mass testing on this group. We haven't been able to verify this. It is just self-reporting.
And then similarly, the report sets out that of this group, so of the 48%, 1 in 5 said they had long COVID. Is that the same?
Yes, it's self-reported.
And of those children, I think what you've set out here is that 70% said that it had limited their daily activities. Is that right?
Of those who self-reported of having long
Yes.
COVID, 70% said that. And we thought that asking that question was important because whether, long COVID in someone's self-assessment could mean lots of different things potentially. So we wanted to really understand what impact is this having on daily activities, and to be able to look at that group who reported severe impacts as a separate population.
And then you've said of that, I think that, yes, so 26% said that they were severely limited. So is that at 2% of the population of children of that?
Of the whole cohort, yes.
Thank you. And I think as well you found a correlation with deprivation as well, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Can I also just ask you about another part of this study, and we see it at the right-hand side, which was, in looking at health, you also looked at physical activity as well, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And I think it's important to say, although this is broken down by reference to the type of school children were at, in fact, this is about exercise outside of school, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think we can see it from the diagram at the bottom as well.
I'd just say on that, we quite often use school type as a bit of a proxy measure for social economic background. So it's not perfect, but overall people from private schools will be much more likely to be from higher social economic groups.
And does that generally then have a correlation with children doing sport or exercise outside of school?
Yes, and you can see that in the pre-pandemic data that those groups are more likely to have done so and report doing so pre-pandemic.
All right. And I think if we just go over the page, please, one of the things that the Sutton Trust thought might assist, and I think if we go down to the second bullet, that it considered that it would be useful to have funding to go into long COVID services. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that children could be accurately assessed. Is that correct?
Yes, and I believe at the time, because this is obviously quite an early point in our understanding of COVID, we took that primarily from calls that we were hearing from groups working on health, because it isn't our primary area of expertise. We'd seen this evidence that, there were a considerable number of young people who were reporting that they were had long COVID. And while small out of the general population, it is a lot of children overall saying that they had, in whole number terms, severe impacts from that we did think that it was important that was examined in further detail, even if it's not our area of expertise.
Thank you. I'm going to move on then, if I may, to the study that you did in respect of children's mental health. And you should have that at tab 8. And it's INQ 000587919.
Yes.
You got that. And again, was this an innovation on the part of the Sutton Trust as well, in terms of looking at mental health?
Yes, similarly, we hadn't looked at mental health really explicitly before this study.
And I think what this sets out, if we look at the highlights, is that there was an increase in the young people in the Cosmo study reporting psychological distress. Is that correct?
When you compare it to other longitudinal studies, so we looked back at other cohorts of young people where there was data available on the same or a very similar question at the same type of age. They don't all match up completely exactly, but as close as we could get it. And we compared Next Steps, which asked that group back in 2007, to Our Future, which compared the same kind of age group in 2017. Now you can see there is an increase between those two cohorts, but then when you compare that to Cosmo, the increase is sharper. Now we don't know that is, it's a continuing trend across young people over time, that their mental health does appear to be worsening, but it does seem to be that the increase was sharper at the point of the pandemic. Now, there are obviously lots of different societal trends that feed into this, and other people are better placed to talk about that in kind of great depth. But we did think it is likely that the pandemic has played a part in that increase.
Well, Dr. Montague, I won't ask you more about that because we do have an expert who will come along and explain some of those trends. But I think in terms of what young people reported to Cosmo, you've set out at the second bullet that the children who reported having distress included those who had reported having long COVID or severe COVID. Is that right?
Yeah, so specifically having long COVID and then broken down by bad or severe long COVID, and also those that had to shield during the pandemic.
And then another group that is identified as well, this is perhaps a broad group, those who had major life events during the pandemic. Is that right?
Yes, so for instance, being seriously ill or having issues being able to afford food.
And then in the next column, another group that you mention was 44% of young people with a parent who had psychological distress. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think that one of the points, if we could just turn over the page, please. Thank you. To page 8. Forgive me. That conclusion that there was a correlation between parental mental ill health and mental ill health in children was something that you thought had broader policy implications. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm just having a look which bit on that page.
I'm so sorry. So it's in the conclusions and policy implications.
Which paragraph?
And it's the first paragraph. So forgive me, I drew your attention to the wrong bit. So in terms of the overall increase in children reporting psychological distress, that was something that the Sutton Trust considered had a broader policy implication. Is that right?
Yes.
And it's over the page, at page 9. that you also considered, and this is the second bullet down,
Yes.
sorry, forgive me, that there were other groups of children who ought to be, specific concerns were raised about as well, and that ought also to be taken into account.
Yes, and the figures, particularly for trans and non-binary reporting students, were very, very high for poor mental health.
Thank you. And then again, the group set out below that is the children whose parents, the first group I referred to inadvertently. Yes. So these were the children as well with parents who had the higher rates of mental ill health as well.
Yes.
Thank you. And if I can move on then, please. And this is at tab 11. Sorry. This is, forgive me, I wanted to come on, if I could then, to just ask you some of the questions. Thank you. And this is the correct documents, INQ 000587942. So this is from May 2023. Is that correct?
I think it's 794.
Yes, sorry, forgive me, I'm looking at the wrong bit of my note rather than the screen. So this was done at a slightly later stage, is that correct?
Is this data, I think, from the second? No, this is still from wave one.
Still
so
from
the first
wave
set,
one,
yes.
But a briefing in May 2023, is that correct?
Yeah, so the only reason that this is later is just the physical time it took us to carry out the work. So this is all based on that first wave of questions to the young people, which would have been in October 2021 to March 2022. It's just some of the data was released by us later in terms of the analysis.
Thank you. I just wanted to check, because in the highlights of this report, this is where you're discussing teacher-assessed grades. Can I check whether or not that was is that a reference to 2021?
Yes.
And to the grades children were assessed then? And what you've set out is that there was a differential in children being satisfied with their teacher-assessed grades. Is that correct?
Yes, although I would say that it is important with these findings to bear in mind that, you know, between those different school types, there may be lots of different reasons that students might say that. So you might have difference in confidence levels between state and independent students anyway, and that will then colour probably what their interpretation is of whether they feel like they're behind compared to others and things like that. So I think with this finding in particular, it's very important to bear in mind that this is the student's own perception.
Yes. And does that mean then that there may be statistical data that might be better at throwing light on this issue rather than the subjective views of what children think?
Yes.
All right. On that page, what I wanted to ask you about at the very bottom was that this is a reference to some of the outcomes of the tutoring programme that had commenced. Is that right?
Yes, in terms of who'd taken it up.
Yes. So is it correct that that this is a reflection of the tutoring programme that had been introduced in schools during the pandemic to help children catch up?
Almost certainly the vast majority of this, yes. But I will say some schools already had tutoring before the pandemic that might have continued and not been part of that programme. And the students wouldn't have known if this tutoring they were doing was particularly through the national tutoring programme or something their school had before. So I think it's a minor point, but I think it's important to bear that in mind.
All right. But in terms of what you found about the national, and I will come back and deal with the national tutoring programme in more detail, but what you found was that it was likely to be offered to those from less advantaged backgrounds. Is that correct?
Yes, but I would say it was still that a lot of better off children did also benefit from it. So they were more likely to have access, but it wasn't exclusive to that group.
And one of the things that I wanted to pick up on was that this reported that boys were more likely to be offered tutoring, but less likely to take it up.
Yes.
And was that a significant finding or an important finding about tutoring?
This is a very interesting question because I don't remember us having a lot of discussions about this at the time. And I'm not sure what the reasons behind that could be, because the teachers made their own assessment as to who in their classes they thought would most benefit. So if they were seeing or they perceived that the boys in their classes needed it more, then that would have been why they offered it more. Or they might have seen initially that boys were reluctant to take it up and then decided to offer it to more of them to be able to get enough of them to take it up, and I'm not sure.
All right, so we can't really say anything more about
Yes.
that based on this. Well, I'll ask you about the National Tutoring Programme then. Is it right that the Sutton Trust considers that tutoring is an effective way to address attainment gaps in children?
Yes, and there's really good evidence on this from the Education Endowment Foundation, which looks at both one-to-one and small group tutoring, and both of them can help pupils, and particularly those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who are eligible for free school meals, to make months of additional progress compared to if they hadn't had that tuition.
And is that sort of provision, is that capable of being put in place during a pandemic or national emergency? So, for example, can that sort of tutoring be done remotely and still help children?
So that's a very interesting question, and it's something we struggled with at the start of the pandemic. So I did, for a short amount of time early on in the National Tutoring Programme's existence, help as a group of charities. A few of us were part-time seconded from lots of different organisations to help the Department for Education to set up the National Tutoring Programme. And at the beginning, a lot less evidence was available on the impact of online versus in-person tutoring. And I believe there is now more, although I'm not certain about what the evidence has said on the differences. But we made the decision that it would be good to offer that as well and to study the impact of it because of the nature of the situation.
Thank you. And can you just assist then in terms of having these large projects of providing tutoring to children in schools? Did you draw conclusions about what helped to make those sorts of programmes work most effectively?
So a lot of the question around what makes this tutoring successful is around quality and consistency. So the Education Endowment Foundation has looked at the evidence on this and given guidance to schools on how to run this tutoring in the best way possible. I can't remember exactly when it came out. It might have been part the way through the pandemic from their learnings, in part from this. But they have guidance on a number of things like the number of contact hours there should be, that it should be kind of coordinated with what students are learning in the curriculum, that students shouldn't be taken out of normal lessons to do this tutoring, it should be additional. And that was a big challenge in the pandemic, is we were attempting with the NTP to make use of existing provision and also to really expand on existing provision. And the quality of that could be quite variable. And as we've discussed, schools were under a lot of strain during the pandemic, so their ability to engage with that programme was also quite limited. And at different points of the NTP, the delivery model differed. So at the very beginning, it was only a mix of external organisations through NTP partners delivering for schools, and also academic mentors who a school could employ but were provided by, I believe, at the start, Teach First, to be actually a member of staff within the school to provide tutoring. Later on, the NTP changed and actually schools were able to use it to pay staff themselves to provide tutoring. We were initially quite worried about that model and the quality of it, but actually some of the assessments subsequently found that that school-based route was quite successful.
Thank you. I want to finish, if I may, then, just with some of the evidence or the analysis carried out by the Sutton Trust about some of the older cohorts of children, and just to ask you some questions about the difficulties that the pandemic imposed on those young people who were leaving school in order to enter the job market, for example, or to take up apprenticeships. Did the pandemic have a specific and particular impact on those young people?
Yes, so there were quite a few issues for apprentices at the time. So apprentices can be on quite low wages anyway. The apprenticeship minimum wage wasn't very high at that period of time. And the furlough scheme could cover their wages during the pandemic, but it's only 80% of a normal wage. So for people already on extremely low wages, we were very concerned about their ability to be able to carry on with their course, being able to afford kind of essentials. There were also issues for the training component of apprenticeships on whether or not young people were able to access remotely that training and the college-based learning that they would normally do as part of that scheme, in the same way as there were worries about being able to access schoolwork as well. And the same issues will have impacted those young people in terms of the digital divide, who had access to devices, a quiet space to learn, all of those sorts of things.
Thank you. And then just finally this, having regard and reflecting on the pandemic, do you think that there is anything practical that could have been done that might have assisted children either in trying to maintain the progress that had been made in closing the disadvantage gap, or in trying to maintain children's access to education so that they didn't get behind?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things on this. So I think I had quite a unique perspective in the pandemic working in education research, but having come from a scientific background that I'd had, and the rest of the inquiry will be much better placed to talk about how well the government could have seen that a pandemic was coming. But I remember thinking very early on that I had had lectures in my undergrad in molecular biology back in 2010 saying a pandemic was going to happen, and being surprised initially at the start of the pandemic of how there wasn't really it didn't feel like there was any plan for those children or young people in the event of this kind of situation happening, even though I'd known from my scientific background that it was very likely that this would happen. So I think there's a question about what planning was done for this type of event in general. A lot of the early research that we looked at was actually looking at the impact on school closures during natural disasters as well. And I think there's a broader question about school closures that have to happen in any instance, whether it's because of a natural disaster or something like a pandemic. What is the government's preparedness for that? Now, at the start of the pandemic, there then was the situation that there was very different access to digital devices. We spent a lot of time throughout the pandemic trying to make the case that the rollout of laptops wasn't quick enough, that not enough students were gaining access to them. I know there were very complicated issues in terms of procurement at the time. I think there were also issues about kind of safeguarding and the software that needed to be on those laptops to give them to young people, and those sorts of issues, and how quickly that could be done given that there were global demands on that kind of technology. I think that's something that would be very interesting to ask government about, and I don't know enough about that process. But certainly from our end, we pointed out how many students still didn't have devices at those later points during the pandemic. And then finally, there's the question of, once that had happened and these students did have those very varying experiences during the pandemic, especially depending on social economic background, what has the response been subsequently? Now, the National Tutoring Programme did exist until, I believe, the 2023-24 academic year. That programme has now been completely cancelled. It doesn't exist anymore. And that's something that we recommended stayed in place to take into account that a lot of the children who had these impacts are still in the school system, especially if they were, say, in primary school at the point of the pandemic happening. And we do think that the evidence we're seeing on the attainment gap means that having that kind of well-evidenced intervention would be really beneficial. At the time in the pandemic, Kevin Collins was the kind of COVID catch-up czar who previously worked at the Education Endowment Foundation, and he made a series of recommendations about lengthening the school day, having kind of targeted support for young people. And he recommended, I believe it was about a 15 billion catch-up programme, which he felt would meet the needs of this group of young people to help them catch up. And what was provided by government was only about a tenth of that. And he then subsequently resigned as a result of feeling that that wasn't adequate. So I think that what had been done wasn't enough. If actions were taken now, like putting in place a national tutoring programme, like potentially increasing pupil premium funds to schools, expanding it at 16 to 18 to making it accessible to those students to help them to catch up, given we know the social economic impacts of these differences, I think those are all positive things that could happen now, which would be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Montacute. I think, my lady, there is a question.
There is one, and I'm hoping that Miss Anidiki Daines, KC, is somewhere on the line to ask her question from Northern Ireland. I can see some nods.
I am here. I don't know, my lady, if you can hear me.
We can hear. Oh, I can both see and hear you now.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for allowing me to ask questions. So, Dr. Montacute, my name is Monia Anidiki Daines, and I'm Senior Counsel for the Northern Ireland Children and Young People's Commissioner. And I just have a couple of questions for you, which really start where you ended, if I may put it that way, which is with the National Tutoring Programme. And what I'd like to ask you is whether you were ever asked, given your experience in Northern Ireland, to either see whether that could be extended to Northern Ireland or to try and work with others to develop something similar for Northern Ireland.
To my knowledge, the Sutton Trust weren't ever asked that. I think the Education Endowment Foundation might have been, and they were more involved than us in the NTP overall, so it would be worth, if possible, asking them if that had ever been asked. But to my knowledge, the Sutton Trust wasn't ever asked.
Well, that's kind of, in that case, now that you've answered in that way, I have only one other question for you, and that is, when you were answering questions just a little while ago to Ms. Dobbin, you talked about producing guidance which could be provided to schools to help them run an equivalent to the National Tutoring Programme. Do you know if anything like that was ever asked for or offered to Northern Ireland?
So it's the Education Endowment Foundation who produced that guidance rather than us. We did replicate some of those findings in some of our reports. I think it's in Tutoring the New Landscape we included, based on that guidance, some tips for schools. At least from the Sutton Trust perspective, I don't think we were asked to provide that to anyone in Northern Ireland. But again, I don't know if the Education Endowment Foundation might have been.
Would you have done it if you were asked?
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed. That completes the questions we have for you, Dr. Montacute. I appreciate you've now left, I think, the Sutton Trust, as I gather. Thank you for all your help with the inquiry, but if you could also pass on our thanks to your former colleagues at Sutton Trust. Best of luck with whatever you're doing at the moment. I think I might have a clue to one of the things you've been doing, but I shouldn't Google people, should I? Thank you very much indeed for your help. We will return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.